It was a regular Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. when the storm that would shake the very foundations of the American legal system began to brew. Inside the halls of the federal courthouse, Judge William Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at the files spread before him. As the presiding judge in the landmark case against Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump, his decisions had attracted more attention than he could have ever anticipated. But on this day, a new chapter was about to begin, one that would force him to flee the country. For months, Karoline Leavitt had been embroiled in an $800 million lawsuit against several political opponents, media outlets, and an array of figures from the opposing side of the aisle. Her lawsuit, filed after a barrage of false accusations and defamation campaigns, had slowly gained momentum. As one of the most powerful women in American politics, her legal team had taken a no-holds-barred approach to fighting back. They weren't just aiming for a legal victory, they wanted revenge. Leavitt had proven herself a fierce force in the political world, using her platform to push back against the media and her critics, often wielding her position at the White House podium as a weapon. But this time, she had a different kind of weapon, an $800 million lawsuit that was picking up speed and threatening to expose a web of corruption that reached high into the political and judicial circles. Judge Reynolds had been assigned to oversee the case, and at first, he had believed it would be just another high-profile case to manage. He couldn't have been more wrong. The moment the lawsuit hit the courts, it sparked an intense media frenzy. News outlets, both conservative and liberal, covered every twist and turn. Karoline's supporters rallied behind her, seeing the lawsuit as a fight for justice, while her opponents viewed it as a political stunt designed to discredit the media and silence dissent. But as the case began to gain traction, it became clear that the stakes were much higher than anyone had anticipated. The lawsuit's reach spread far beyond the courtroom. It threatened to uncover skeletons in closets that many powerful figures in Washington, D.C. desperately wanted to keep hidden. And the deeper it went, the more Judge Reynolds began to feel the pressure. Despite his impeccable career and spotless reputation, Reynolds had found himself in a dangerous position. Influential figures had started to approach him, subtly suggesting how he should rule. Some threatened him, while others offered him rewards if he played his cards right. The judge, caught between his commitment to justice and the overwhelming pressure from both sides, began to crack under the strain. A series of late-night phone calls, cryptic messages, and veiled threats made Reynolds uneasy. He was just a man trying to do his job. But he quickly realized the forces at play were much larger than he had ever imagined. Some whispered about the possibility of Leavitt using her lawsuit to dismantle her political opponents in the media and beyond. Others warned him of a secret deal with shadowy figures who stood to gain from the case's outcomes. The tipping point came when the pressure on Reynolds intensified. Leavitt's legal team, led by a charismatic and ruthless attorney, Cynthia Maxwell, had pushed for a faster pace in the proceedings. They were making it clear that they wanted the case to move quickly, and they were prepared to take extreme measures to ensure it did. Rumors began to circulate that Reynolds had been targeted as a weak link, and that some within the legal and political circles wanted him out of the picture. One fateful morning, Reynolds received an anonymous envelope slipped under his office door. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper with a single sentence. "You are being watched. Move too slow, and you will regret it." The message was chilling, and it was the moment Reynolds realized just how much danger he was in. The next day, the case's proceedings took an unexpected turn. Maxwell had filed an urgent motion to speed up the trial process, and her argument was compelling. The damage to Leavitt's reputation, she argued, had been done over several years, and the ongoing defamation needed immediate redress. The judge, already under immense stress, was finding it harder to make impartial decisions. The room fell silent as Reynolds began to deliberate. He knew that if he granted the motion, it would move the case into an accelerated timeline, one that could bring things to a head sooner than anyone was ready for. The pressure to rule quickly was unbearable, and as he scanned the room, he saw the faces of those waiting for his decision. Maxwell's sharp eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, it felt as though she was daring him to make a mistake. Judge Reynolds could almost hear the ticking of a clock in his mind, reminding him that time was running out. It wasn't just the legal case at risk. His very safety and career were on the line. As he banged his gavel and declared, "The motion is granted," the room erupted in murmurs. The decision would undoubtedly speed up the process, and it would force the case into a critical phase faster than anyone expected. But Reynolds could already feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, a decision that would soon spiral far beyond his control. The ruling sent shockwaves through the legal and political spheres. The media, which had been closely following the lawsuit, exploded with headlines speculating about what the accelerated trial would mean for the future of Karoline Leavitt and her opponents. The lawsuit, now moving at an unprecedented pace, was suddenly at the center of a legal firestorm. Judge Reynolds sat in his chambers that evening, his mind racing. He had never been one to bow to pressure, but the circumstances surrounding this case were unlike anything he had ever encountered. The whispers about shadowy figures, the cryptic messages, and the mounting threats had shaken him to his core. Still, he told himself that he had made the right call. After all, the speed of the trial was necessary for the sake of justice. But deep down, a gnawing sense of unease lingered, as if the courtrooms were closing in on him. Leavitt's legal team wasted no time in capitalizing on the judge's ruling. The pace of the proceedings was now set, and it was moving faster than anyone had predicted. The media frenzy around the case reached new heights. The faster the trial moved, the more people wanted to know about its inner workings. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted on Judge Reynolds, who soon realized that this case was bigger than just a lawsuit. It had become a political war, one that could potentially change the very fabric of American governance. Maxwell, Leavitt's lead attorney, had always been known for her fierce determination, but now, she was pushing beyond the limits of traditional legal strategy. She was using the accelerated timeline to unearth hidden evidence, making bold claims about Leavitt's opponents in the media and government. The rapid pace was forcing witnesses to testify under intense scrutiny, with little time for preparation. Reynolds found himself unable to keep up, caught in the whirlwind of the case's mounting momentum. Then came the bombshell. During a court session, a confidential piece of evidence that had been kept under wraps for months was suddenly leaked to the press. It was a video, one that purportedly showed high-ranking officials in the media colluding to spread false narratives about Leavitt. The video, though heavily edited and ambiguous, was enough to spark an uproar. The news cycle exploded, with pundits on both sides of the political spectrum calling it a game-changer. Karoline Leavitt had just become a symbol of resistance against a corrupt media establishment. The video set off a chain reaction. Within days, investigations were launched into the alleged media conspiracy. Pressure was mounting on the judge to ensure that the case proceeded smoothly and quickly. But behind closed doors, Reynolds was beginning to realize that his ruling to accelerate the trial was far from a simple legal decision. It had become a political landmine. Late one evening, as Reynolds walked through the courthouse parking lot, he received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "We need to talk. Now." It was Cynthia Maxwell. "What's going on?" Reynolds asked, his voice strained. "There's something you need to understand," Maxwell said. "You've just made this case much bigger than anyone imagined. Leavitt isn't just fighting a defamation suit anymore. She's fighting a war. And so are you." Reynolds' heart began to race. "What are you talking about?" Maxwell's voice lowered, becoming more serious. "There are people watching you. They know what you're doing. They know that you're under pressure. They think they can control you. But if you're not careful, you'll become a pawn in their game. We're not just talking about a lawsuit anymore. This is a battle for power." Reynolds felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He had known things were bad, but hearing Maxwell speak so bluntly about the larger forces at play was unsettling. He had been a judge for years and he had seen the darker side of politics, but this felt different. It felt personal. Maxwell continued, "You need to understand that your ruling has consequences. You've already crossed a line. You need to make sure you're on the right side of this, or else you'll be the one left holding the bag when the dust settles." The line went dead. The judge stood frozen in the parking lot, the weight of Maxwell's words sinking in. He had thought he was merely following the law, but now he understood that the stakes were much higher than just the case at hand. Leavitt's lawsuit was no longer just about defamation. It was about power over the media, power over public opinion, and perhaps even power over the judiciary itself. Reynolds returned to his office that night, his mind spinning with possibilities. What had he gotten himself into? The pressure was mounting from all sides, and no matter how much he tried to focus on the law, the political implications of his decisions were beginning to overtake him. The whispers of corruption in the media and government had started to feel like they were closing in on him. But as the days went by, it became clear that escaping from this situation would not be so easy. The very next day, a new twist emerged. A mysterious figure had been seen meeting with Leavitt's team, and rumors began circulating that Reynolds himself had been compromised. It wasn't just the media that was attacking him now, it was the very forces he had once believed he could trust. In the courtroom, Leavitt's team pushed forward with their strategy, each move accelerating the case toward a climax. Meanwhile, Reynolds, caught in the crossfire, realized that his role in the trial had become untenable. He could no longer remain neutral. He was being dragged into a web of politics, and if he wasn't careful, it could cost him everything. The following weeks were nothing short of a nightmare for Judge Reynolds. His every move was being scrutinized, and his once peaceful life had become a maze of fear and uncertainty. The faster the case moved, the more he felt himself losing control. It wasn't just about legal procedure anymore, it was about survival. Whispers had grown louder in the corridors of the courthouse. Some said Reynolds was being controlled from behind the scenes. Others claimed that he was in over his head and that the pressure had gotten to him. As each day passed, Reynolds found it harder to ignore the fact that he was no longer just a judge. He had become a player in a high-stakes game where the rules kept changing and the consequences of failure were unimaginable. Leavitt's legal team had used every weapon in their arsenal to keep the momentum going. Maxwell, as the lead attorney, had masterfully crafted a strategy that kept Reynolds on edge. The rapid pace of the trial was taking its toll. Key witnesses had been called in and cross-examined with precision, and the evidence had begun to mount against the media outlets and political figures accused of defaming Leavitt. But it wasn't just the case that was putting pressure on Reynolds, it was everything around it. One evening, as Reynolds was preparing for yet another day of testimony, he received another anonymous envelope. This one was different, though. Instead of a threatening message, there was a photograph inside. The picture was grainy but clear enough to show a dark figure standing outside his home. The message that accompanied it was chilling. You are being watched. If you don't act fast, things will get worse. The photo seemed to be a warning, a reminder that the clock was ticking and the powers controlling the case were not afraid to make things personal. For the first time, Reynolds considered what he had been unwilling to think about before: fleeing. He had heard rumors that Leavitt's team had been in contact with some very influential people, individuals with the kind of power that extended far beyond Washington, D.C. These people weren't just about winning a lawsuit. They were about reshaping the political landscape of the country, and Reynolds had become a key figure in their plans. Maxwell had warned him, but it wasn't until now that Reynolds understood the full extent of the danger. His ruling to speed up the trial had set in motion a chain of events that could end his career and possibly his life. The very same people who had pushed him into making that ruling were now preparing to discard him as a liability. He was expendable. The tension in the courtroom had been palpable, with Leavitt's legal team continuously demanding faster proceedings. Maxwell, in particular, had been relentless. She was no longer just fighting for a lawsuit, she was fighting for something much bigger. She understood that the speed of the trial was critical to achieving her goals. If Reynolds buckled under pressure, everything could unravel. But if he continued to push forward, there was a chance to break open the entire system that had once seemed invincible. But what Reynolds didn't know was that his every move was being watched, monitored, and manipulated. And the people controlling the strings were closing in. Late one night, Reynolds met with an old friend, an investigative journalist named Michael Carrington. The two had known each other for years, and Reynolds trusted him implicitly. Carrington had been digging into the case, and he had uncovered something that would change everything. "William," Carrington said, his voice low, "there's something you need to see. Something bigger than the lawsuit. There's a network of people behind this whole thing. They've got their hands in everything from the media to the political elite. And they've been using this case as a smokescreen to cover up their true intentions." Reynolds listened intently as Carrington laid out the details. The investigation had revealed that several high-profile figures in both the government and the media had been orchestrating the public narrative around Leavitt's lawsuit. But there was more, much more. According to Carrington, the lawsuit was being used as leverage in a covert operation to influence the outcome of the upcoming presidential election. The lawsuit wasn't just about defamation, it was about power. Reynolds felt the room spin as the weight of the revelation hit him. The case he had been so determined to manage had turned into a political weapon. His role in the entire affair was no longer about delivering justice, it was about being manipulated into playing a part in something much darker. That's why they need you, William, Carrington continued. They need you to stay in the picture long enough for them to get the results they want. And once it's all over, they'll toss you aside. You'll be nothing but a pawn in their game. Reynolds sat back in his chair, stunned. The implications were enormous. He had always believed in the law, in the pursuit of justice. But now it seemed like the very system he had sworn to protect was being used against him. I don't know what to do anymore, Mike, Reynolds said, his voice breaking. I'm trapped. Carrington leaned forward, his eyes serious. You have two choices, William. You can keep going, playing the role they've assigned to you. Or you can walk away. But if you walk away, you need to leave the country. Fast. The weight of Carrington's words sank in. Reynolds had known things had gotten bad, but he hadn't realized just how bad. The forces working against him were too powerful, too far-reaching. The only way to protect himself and his family was to disappear. The very next morning, Reynolds made his decision. He would flee the country. Judge Reynolds had spent the last few days making preparations, though it felt surreal. He had never imagined his life would take such a drastic turn. As a man of the law, he had been trained to uphold justice, to serve the public trust. But now he was preparing to run for his life. The world around him had shifted, and it was no longer a question of right and wrong, it was about survival. Reynolds knew that leaving would be difficult. He had built a reputation over the years as a staunch advocate for the rule of law, and walking away would raise countless questions. But what could he do? The case had spiraled beyond his control, and those pulling the strings were far too powerful. If he remained, the cost would be his freedom, his career, perhaps even his life. Carrington had helped him with the logistics. There was a contact, a former intelligence operative who could help Reynolds get out of the country without leaving a trace. The plan was simple, one-way flight, minimal contact, and a new identity. No one could know where he was going or why he was leaving. If Reynolds stayed in the country, the people behind the lawsuit would destroy him. His only option was to disappear. His last night in Washington was spent in a haze of preparations. He packed only the essentials, his passport, some cash, and a few documents that might prove useful later. He wouldn't be able to take much with him, everything else would be left behind. He wasn't sure when or if he would ever return. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest, but there was no turning back. In the early hours of the morning, as the streets of Washington were still quiet, Reynolds left his apartment for the last time. Carrington had arranged for a driver to take him to an undisclosed location where he would meet his contact. It felt like he was walking away from everything he had known, as if he were stepping into another world entirely. The journey to the airport was tense, the silence in the car only broken by the occasional murmur from the driver. Reynolds looked out the window, taking in the skyline of Washington, D.C. one last time. He wondered what would happen to the case now that he was gone. Would Leavitt's lawsuit continue without him? Would the media frenzy die down, or would it escalate even further? There were too many unknowns, too many questions that he would never have the answers to. At the airport, Reynolds met his contact, a man named Gregory who had once worked in intelligence operations. Gregory was calm, composed, and utterly professional. He gave Reynolds a small envelope with the details of his new identity and travel documents. This is the only way, Gregory said, his voice low. You can't afford to be seen or heard. It's your life now. You're a ghost. Reynolds took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He had never been this scared in his life, yet there was a strange sense of relief. The moment of escape was finally here. But even as he boarded the plane, he couldn't shake the nagging thought in the back of his mind. What would happen to Karoline Leavitt and the lawsuit? Would they succeed in their mission? And most importantly, would anyone find out what really happened? The flight was long, and Reynolds passed the time by thinking about the events that had led to this moment. The lawsuit had started as a simple defamation case, but it had spiraled into something far more dangerous. The media had been complicit in spreading the narrative, and the political elite had used the case to further their own agendas. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he was free, at least for the time being. As the plane touched down in a foreign country, Reynolds knew that his life would never be the same. He stepped off the plane into the unknown, no longer a judge, no longer a man of the law, but a fugitive. His former life was behind him, and now he would have to create a new identity, a new existence. Part 5, The Consequences of Flight. Reynolds had settled into a quiet life abroad, but the peace he had hoped for never came. His thoughts were consumed by the events that led to his escape. He had left everything behind, his career, his family, his identity. It wasn't just the case that haunted him, it was the knowledge that he had been a pawn in a much larger game, one that he had never fully understood. In the months that followed, the political situation in the United States grew even more volatile. Leavitt's lawsuit, now a distant memory, had achieved its intended effect. The media frenzy continued to fuel the flames of division within the country, and the forces behind the lawsuit had successfully manipulated the narrative to their advantage. Leavitt emerged as a hero to her supporters, a symbol of resilience in the face of corruption, while her opponents were left to deal with the fallout. But as Reynolds watched from afar, he couldn't help but wonder, what was the true cost of all this? Was Leavitt simply a victim of a flawed system, or was she an active participant in a much larger scheme? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he might never know the full truth. Leavitt's team had won the lawsuit, and the political landscape had shifted dramatically. But for Reynolds, the victory came at too high a price. He had escaped with his life, but he had lost everything that had once mattered to him. His reputation, his career, his role in the legal system, all of it was gone. And for what? So that a political agenda could advance? So that the power brokers behind the scenes could further their own interests? In the end, Reynolds' decision to flee had been a survival instinct. But as the years went by, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he had abandoned something more important than just his career. He had abandoned the truth. And in the world of politics and power, truth was often the first casualty.